We will go ahead and get started, and maybe some folks will join us along the way, but thank you for everyone who's joined us so far. I am Heather with the Friends of the Lower Appomattox River, and tonight we have a Riverfront Resources Webinar with some partners, and tonight we're being funded by the Virginia Environmental Endowment. So next slide, Jackie. So if you don't know who FOLAR is, we are the Friends of the Lower Appomattox River, and I'm joined here tonight by the rest of our staff at the Friends of the Lower Appomattox River and some partners. And you can see our mission statement here on the slide. And we're accomplishing our mission through several programs. The main one is developing a Appomattox River Trail park and trail system through the entire region, really providing access to folks to be able to get to the river. And we also host events like the paddle battle. We host volunteering along the trail and education events like you're at tonight. So we really appreciate your support and coming out to support us. And just to mention, we do serve the Tri-Cities region, which is centered in Petersburg, and our service area starts at the dam of Lake Chesden and Chesterfield and Dinwiddie and goes all the way to where the Appomattox River meets the James River in Hopewell. So next slide. We do have a pretty quick program tonight, and most of it is going to be our partners presenting, but I do want to give you a quick overview about water quality so we all are on the same page. And then I'm going to hand it over to our partners who are going to really share with you information on how you can improve water quality on your own property. So we have Dea from the Virginia Department of Forestry, Blair from the Virginia Association of Soil and Water Conservation Districts, and Joey from the James River Association. And they'll all be making presentations momentarily. So on the next slide, you'll see we just have a couple slides that really kind of go into the basic terminology. We want to make sure we're all understanding the terms that all of our speakers are going to use tonight. And the first one is stormwater runoff. So here is an official definition from the EPA of what stormwater runoff is. But stormwater runoff, when the rain comes down, it hits the ground and some of that rain infiltrates into the ground. But the rain that doesn't infiltrate is called stormwater runoff. And as it's going over the land, it picks up pollutants from our roofs or our parking lots, farm fields, anything that the water flows over, it picks up pollutants and goes into our natural waters. And so what we're talking about tonight is how to clean up that stormwater runoff before it gets into our natural lakes. So next slide. So what we're going to talk about tonight are best management practices. And best management practices is a word that houses a bunch of different practices that cleans up stormwater runoff. And so every industry uses the term BMP, but it might mean something slightly different to the agriculture and forestry industry than it means to a homeowner, than it means to a developer. So BMP is just a term that we all use in different industries to talk about how we clean up stormwater. Stormwater, we are making sure that we're reducing the quantity and the quality of stormwater before it reaches our natural streams, rivers, and then the Chesapeake Bay. So we want to reduce the quantity so it's not reaching those water bodies so fast and so much in a storm event. And we also want to make sure we're cleaning up the quality, because stormwater pollution has two types of pollution. Pollution you can see, like trash and debris, maybe dirt, sediment. That's all things we can see in the water. But it also has pollutants we can't see, like E. coli or phosphorus and nitrogen. And these pollutants all make the water harmful to maybe drink, to recreate in, or harmful to our wildlife and our plant life. So we really all want to work together to improve water quality. And we do that through these best management practices. And we have a picture here of one you might see in an urban setting and one that you would all be familiar with, and you see BMPs every day. You might not notice that you see them every day, but you do. And if you're at a mall or a shopping center, you often see those big ponds that have fences around them. That's a BMP. It's a BMP called a retention pond. So you see these every day throughout your life. You just maybe don't know the technical term or exactly what they're doing, but we're going to show you some BMPs tonight that you can do at your properties to help the water quality of the Appomattox River and the Chesapeake Bay. And then our final word for you tonight, before we get to our speakers, next slide, is riparian buffer. So again, just some fancy words that means trees or shrubs next to a body of water. And Daya's and Joey are both gonna show you some more examples of what our riparian buffer could look like. But again, the riparian buffers are a type of BMP. And they, of course, help that stormwater runoff we talked about, but they also help with air pollution. And you might not think about how air pollution actually becomes water pollution someday as the air pollution deposits into the water. So trees are a really great BMP that are cleaning up multiple types of pollution through our environment. This is a great image from our riparian consortium that Joey's going to talk about, that really shows you how trees can help in urban settings and rural settings. And you're going to hear a lot about that tonight. So I'm going to take a pause and see if there's any questions. We can go to the next slide, Jackie. If there's any questions on these terms, and if not, then I'm going to hand it over to our first speaker. Okay, well, all of our speakers know these terms well too, and they're going to probably talk about them more. So please put your name in the chat if you are able to. And if you have a specific concern on your property, go ahead and tell us that in the chat now, so we can kind of start thinking about it while our speakers are talking. If we could hold your questions till the end, and then we'll take all of our questions together after all three speakers go. But please go ahead and use the chat and ask any questions as we go along. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Daya, who's going to share with you a new program at the Department of Forestry for your properties.
And I am the brand new program that we got launched this year called Riparian Forests for Landowners. The acronym is RIFL. Next slide, please. Right, so Heather got into a little bit about what a riparian buffer is. Just want to point out it's a pretty inexpensive, cost-effective way to protect water quality. Next slide, please. And so I'm just going to dive right in. We've got an introduction to what a riparian forest is, but I want to tell you about what RIFL is all about. So just the basics off the bat, it provides turnkey funding to provide forested riparian buffer project planning, installation, and 1 year of maintenance. And it's available throughout Virginia. Next slide, please. A little bit about the funding for the program. So we have two sources of funding to get this going. So we have funds from the Inflation Reduction Act. So that's federal funding. And this has a stipulation that we use it on areas that have been recognized as underserved according to the Climate and Environmental Justice Screening Tool. And then the other half of our funding comes from the State Water Quality Improvement Fund, and that money can be used on any kind of property. Next slide, please. And so who's eligible for, accessing the program? It's very flexible. So it's any private landowner with a water feature on their land with space for a forested buffer. Next slide, please. And just sort of a rundown of what I mean by water feature. So it's the things that you kind of recognize as, what you think of as a riparian area, the streams, rivers, lakes, but also sort of the less, concrete areas, or even if we're getting into the coastal areas, we can work in saltwater marshes. A wetland can be the water feature, and even ditches or any other man-made feature. Next slide, please. All right, so a little more detail about what kind of is needed to be eligible for the program and some of the requirements. So we recognize that 35 feet is sort of the kind of the minimum width that a buffer needs to be to protect water quality, to capture that runoff and nutrients. So on your property, the buffer needs to be a minimum of 35 feet from the edge of the water. We can help with planting for up to 300 feet from the edge of the water. And we made a decision to focus on sites that have a sort of lower level of invasive plant species, just because unfortunately invasive plants are pretty common these days, but they take kind of a lot of work and a concentration to manage those. So we're asking that sites be 20% or less invaded, and that would be something you would determine with either one of our partners, or a DOF forester would help you figure that out. And just to be clear, we're using young seedlings. They're called bare root seedlings, so not larger potted plants. And species that we're choosing have to be native, so no exotic and no cultivars. And I think the main aspect of a landowner agreement that we would have is that you keep that forested buffer in place for 15 years after the planting. Next slide, please. And so this is just an example of an urban buffer that was established, and those sort of tube things you see sticking up, the seedlings are inside there. So they're, like I said, they're very small, so they need protection. And it's a little bit hard to see, but there's some shorter tubes up in the kind of middle of the yard, and that I was just showing this image to kind of show what 35 feet looks like. And this was a nice project where we had two landowners, one on each side of the creek, deciding to install riparian buffers at the same time. So that compound effect is great, getting both sides buffered. Next slide, please. And so how our program is set up is we have contracting partners to help us carry out the program throughout the state. So you'll notice a lot of these are nonprofits, and they have a connection to that particular area that they work in. And that was something that we thought was important when creating this program, that we have partners that are familiar with the landowners that they're working with, and the landscape, and what does best in that area. So we've got the James River Association as one of our partners. Joey's going to speak to you later today. Friends of the Rappahannock, York River Steward, Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay, and Watershed Restoration Solutions. Next slide, please. So again, this is at no cost to the landowner to get the buffer established. So you would work with a experienced representative of one of the other organizations we're working with or a DOF forester, and they would help you come up with the plan for the buffer. And that would include site preparation, buffer planting, and 1 year of maintenance. Next slide, please. So just thinking about our timeline. So at this point, our program is available for sign up this fall. And then planting will occur either this fall or next spring. Next slide, please. I just kind of threw this in. So that was sort of a before, and this was 3 years after we did this planting. So you can see the shrubs come in out of those tubes. Next slide, please. And then after the planting, you get into the maintenance phase, and that's going to be covered through spring of 2026. So that's a lot of the maintenance is focused on competition control, just giving those trees a good start so that they can grow, come up out of those tubes and kind of hold their own against that competition. So there's, creating a weed-free area around the tube and mowing. Those are a couple of examples of maintenance, along with making sure those tubes stay in good shape. Next slide, please. And so that's Riffle. So if you're interested in signing up, we have a landowner interest form on our website. I'm going to put that in the chat so you can go straight to it. And if you're familiar with your local forester, you can also talk to them. And I'll also put my information in the chat and you can reach out to me directly. Thank you. I guess we'll be taking questions at the end. But feel free to put your questions in the chat as well if you have something you want to ask right now. So next up, Blair is going to be speaking to you from the Soil and Water Conservation District.
Yeah, thank you for the handoff. So I'm going to talk about VCAP, the Virginia Conservation Assistance Program. My name is Blair Blanchette. I'm the VCAP coordinator, and I work for the Association of Soil and Water Conservation Districts. It's a very long title. I'll be saying it several times, so forgive me in advance. Next slide. So a little bit about who we are. So I work for the association. We support all 47 soil and water conservation districts across the state. You may not realize it, but you have voted for directors that serve on the boards of these districts. So keep your eyes peeled, not this election, but in the future, maybe think back to some past elections and might get some context there. The association's mission is to provide and promote leadership in conservation of natural resources and through stewardship and education. So stewardship and education, stewardship being these cost share programs that the districts administer, including VCAP, and education, I won't touch on it today, but I do want to mention that districts work a lot in education of youth, including managing the state Envirothon competition, which is a very neat opportunity for high school students. And if you click one more time, it'll highlight a couple of words. Jackie, thank you. So today I'm focusing on conservation efforts. So VCAP, the other half of district work, is the agricultural cost share program, VAX. So if you are a farmer or a producer or know someone that is, they might have connected with districts that way. And local member districts, as I mentioned, there are 47 districts across the state. Some of them serve one locality, some of them serve multiple localities, and I'll touch on which is relevant to this group a little bit later in the presentation. Next slide. So VCAP is a cost share program. And what I mean by that is we provide a partial reimbursement on installations that manage stormwater. We support eligible stormwater best management practices. So Heather kind of touched on this. There's an array of practices that support water quality, and we have about a dozen of them that we offer. And VCAP is administered through participating soil and water conservation districts. So every district is eligible to administer VCAP, but not all of them do right now. That's partially because we're still kind of a young program, so some districts are learning. Some of them focus on VACs. So while I will acknowledge the ones that work on VCAP right now, if you find that you're in a district that does not administer VCAP, contact them anyway. You can always express interest and just let them know so that we can kind of get a record of where we might need to focus our efforts, our training, staff, that kind of thing. Next slide. So this is our suite of practices. It is a broad array. So I want to touch on them each. Starting with conservation landscaping, that one in the upper left. So there's actually 5 subtypes of conservation landscaping. One of them is buffers. The others are mixed planting beds. So these are mulched beds, essentially. We also have meadows, tree plantings, and filter strips, which have some little more engineering to them than their name might imply. So conservation landscaping is our most popular practice, just by and large. Everyone loves their native plants. It's gotten much more popular in the last few years. Permeable pavement is our second most popular practice, and then kind of decreasing in how frequently we see applications as we go down the line. So rainwater harvesting, also very popular, as are rain gardens. Living shorelines are not a stormwater management practice, but they are still a component of VCAP for tidal areas only. And then a couple other ones I want to point out that are a little bit different. Impervious surface removal, so this is taking up asphalt or even compacted gravel and replacing it with something that is pervious. That might be another practice like a rain garden or conservation landscaping. It might be turf grass. And then one I also want to touch on briefly, constructed wetland. We offer constructed wetland and no one has ever taken us up on it. So if you really have a desire for a constructed wetland in an appropriate location, I would love to see one. So next slide, please. Our funding comes from primarily DEQ and DCR, so the Department of Environmental Quality and the Department of Conservation and Recreation. And the reason I mention this is it guides a lot of the reasoning, the strategy, the specifications behind our work. So you can see I have listed resource concern on the left. So to be eligible for a VCAP practice for this funding, you have to have a resource concern, an issue that we are mitigating. So the 3 that we have are erosion, poor cover, and excess runoff. And I'll have some photos of those in a second. We have eligible properties. So your homes are our priority, but businesses, schools, nonprofits, and faith organizations are also eligible. Really, the only properties that are not eligible are state-owned lands, federally owned lands, and then agricultural lands, and that's because of the sister program, VACs. And then lastly, just as Dea mentioned, we also have specifications. So DOF's buffers are 35 feet. We have specifications to make sure we're getting a particular amount of treatment or water quality benefit. So for instance, these practices like rain gardens have to capture a 1-inch rainstorm off of whatever surfaces that are draining into them. We have to have a 90% ground cover on our conservation landscaping, 12-foot centers for tree plantings, things like that. So I don't want to go into the specifics necessarily of each practice. We have a manual that goes over it, and the district staff are there to walk our applicants through that program or that process. But it can be a little bit confusing about why we're asking for certain standards to be met, and it's because we want to achieve a particular water quality benefit. The one I didn't list, I do want to mention that Dea touched on, is we also require the use of native plants only. Next slide. So here are some examples of resource concerns. So on the left, you can see there's like standing water. That would be excess runoff. The center image, there's kind of a loss of ground cover a little bit, but what I really want to point out is there's standing sediment on what appears to be a hard surface. So that's evidence of excess runoff even when it's not raining. In the last image, that poor cover where we can't get grass to grow, that kind of thing. And we've got some images later of standing water as well. So we're looking for something like this, an issue that we're going to address with a practice. Next slide. Everyone likes pretty photos, so I wanted to make sure I showed you guys some practices. So in the upper left, we've got a conservation landscaping. This was a meadow and is still one of the most beautiful practices I've ever seen. The landowners have really maintained it incredibly. Lower left is a vegetated stormwater conveyance. In the center is a dry well. Below is impermeable surface removal. Upper right is an infiltration trench. And next is a cistern. So next slide. A couple more photos before and after. So this was another conservation landscaping that just turned out phenomenally. This was a home. Next slide. This is a rain garden. So they had poor cover and excess runoff. You can see the inlet in the bottom right and upper left. Next slide. This was a living shoreline. This like failing bulkhead was replaced. This was right after the planting. So I've seen pictures since this one was taken, and the grass is very lush. And next slide. And then this is kind of a top left, top right, bottom left, bottom right situation. So this landowner had standing water in their yard, went for an infiltration trench that was quite sizable, filled it with sand and gravel, and then reseeded on top of the area at the end. Next slide. So cost share program, as I mentioned, we don't cover 100% of total costs. We cover between 35 and 80% of total costs up to a practice cap. So I realize this is a little bit challenging to look at, but if we took conservation landscaping, for instance, the applicant can choose one of two contract lengths, either 5 years or 10 years. And if you choose the shorter contract, you get slightly less funding. We're incentivizing that long contract. And up to a cap of $7,000. So if you have a really big practice, you could probably get the same amount of money, but more often than not, choosing the long contract is to your benefit. Above, like the more complicated practices, more engineered, like permeable pavers, bioretention, we are not offering that shorter contract. They are all 10 years, but they are more significant amounts of money going out the door. So like a living shoreline, you can receive up to $30,000. Next slide. So this is a map of our districts. For FOLAR, the James River Soil and Water Conservation District will be the primary contact. They serve Chesterfield County and Prince George County. I will have a link at the end that talks about where you can find your district if you live somewhere else or have property somewhere else in the state. But if you live in Chesterfield or Prince George, James River Soil and Water is your go-to. Next slide. Oh, and I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go through this as fast as I can. The process for applying for VCAP is express interest first, contact your district, find out if they participate. They might do a pre-screening phone call. Typically, the district will do a desktop analysis prior to meeting with you, looking at the soils, the slope, property lines, that kind of thing. If they deem it like an appropriate use of their time, or if they think that a practice will work for you, they will come out and do a site visit and get to know what your goals are, and then support you through the application development process. A key component here is work cannot begin before an application is approved. We require you to wait, otherwise funding is denied. The application has to be approved by your local soil and water board and a state steering committee. After it's approved, installation can begin. Keep all of your receipts, and then you will submit a payment through that same double approval process, and the check will be cut to the applicant. Next slide. I'm very proud to say we have over 1,000 projects on the ground now, and over $8 million in cost share with almost $7 million in homeowner contributions. So the program has come really far in about 8 years. Next slide. So I'll put these in the chat. My contact information and our assistant coordinator's contact information is there. A link to our manual. And then again, the district directory, if you live elsewhere in the state, I will link. But the main contact point is James River SWCD at jamesriverswcd.org. And since I've gone over my time, I will turn it over to Joey.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Joey Shelton. I'm the Restoration Field Manager for James River Association. A little bit about JRA. So we cover the entire James watershed. You can see on this map here. So what we're showing is a map of our action team, and our action team is responsible for restoration. So in kind of like the big blob on the left, that's where we're going to focus more on the upper and middle James watersheds, where we're going to do riparian forest buffers. And then that lower blob, kind of just downstream of Richmond, is going to be our living shorelines. So there's a little bit of overlap kind of in the Tri-Cities area where we're looking. So it's kind of an area where you could kind of do a little bit of both. But today I'm going to be focusing on riparian buffers. Next slide, please. So here's a map of the upper and middle James watershed. The upper James, they handle the same program, the James River Buffer Program, but that's run through the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. So JRA covers just kind of the middle James, which starts with Amherst and Nelson and goes east down to Richmond. I'm responsible of all the projects that are going to take place in Nottoway, Prince George, Chesterfield, Amelia, and anywhere else in the Appomattox watershed. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the James River Buffer Program, and it's going to sound like I'm repeating a lot of things that Dana already said, but it's a little bit different in kind of some of the programmatic issues and some of the details of the program. So we launched back in 2019 with our buffer program. What's covered as part of the program is going to be the design, the site preparation, the materials, which include seedlings and shelters, labor, projects establishment for 3 years. So that's the difference in the James River Buffer Program versus the RIFL is we get the 3 years of establishment maintenance. And same thing as the other RIFL program is that we cover 100% of all costs. And down at the bottom, you can see that we are generously funded by the Virginia Environmental Endowment. Next slide. So who is eligible to participate in the James River Buffer Program? Daya's list was much more elaborate than mine, but do you have water on your property? This could be a creek, stream, farm pond, lake, seep, really anything that is some source of water on your property. Are you interested in restoring that riparian edge? So that's going to be a huge qualifier. Do you want to do it? You have to have a minimum of 35 feet. So sometimes we do run into issues, particularly in residential areas where homeowners aren't able to get that 35-foot width. But if you do have 35 foot and we go out to 100 feet in width of buffer, so there's, again, a slight difference between James River Buffer Program and the RIFL program. And then anybody that lives in the middle or upper James watershed is eligible. Next slide. So the application process is really simple, and I'm going to drop the website link down here in the chat when I'm done. But essentially, just go to our website, put in the address of the property that you want to submit. We do have a lot of property owners who don't necessarily live on their site, so make sure you're submitting the application for the project you want to enlist in the program, and then drop that in, and then either myself or one of my peers who covers the Western counties will be in touch with you about setting up a site visit. Next slide. So here we're going to talk about what it looks like when you apply for the James River Buffer Program. So the first thing we're going to do is reach out to you, the landowner. We're going to schedule a site visit so we can take a look at your property, determine eligibility, answer any questions you might have. And so what we do at this point is we're really trying to identify the needs and wants of the landowner. So what are your goals other than potentially just water quality restoration? We're seeing a huge uptick now in people wanting to plant consumable forests. So going out and be able to cultivate food. You could want to put in a wildlife corridor. You could put in habitat that's more advantageous for deer and turkey. So developing kind of a custom buffer for you and the needs of your property and the landowner. So, next slide. So site preparation, and this varies greatly on sites. If you have a residential area, this might just be mowing your yard. But in some of our larger kind of agricultural areas, this could be mowing. A big thing we harp on is the invasive species treatment. So we want to go ahead and eradicate as many of those invasive species as possible before we actually put trees in the ground. So kind of left picture, you can see an example of a contractor on site using some basil bark spray to treat some woody invasives. Down at the bottom, you see just mowing a cow pasture prior to planting. And then forestry mulching, if you've never seen that, it's basically just like a lawnmower on steroids that just destroys the forest. This is really kind of like the only tool that's really useful when it comes to treating large swaths of large invasive like bushes and stuff. So we have the opportunity to help landowners with the site prep as well. So next slide. So our project materials, Daya again talked a little bit about this, but you can see there that left stack, those are going to be our tree shelters. So there are different types of tree shelters. Those are the ones that are most common are those 2x. But we've done projects in kind of more urban and park settings, and they make a dark green version that's available to people as well. So it's a little bit more aesthetically pleasing, kind of blends into the background. But 99% of the projects we are going to use those tubes on the left. And then some pictures of those seedlings that she alluded to earlier, those 1 to 2 year old buried seedlings. Next slide. So project installation, when it comes down to the day of putting it in the ground, we either go with a contractor for larger sites or more complicated projects. But most of the time, for smaller sites, we use volunteers. And so for anybody who has a project normally under about an acre, we install those with volunteers, and it's a great way to engage with like your local community members and different chapters of master naturalists and master gardeners, those sorts of people. So yeah, next slide. And then establishment maintenance. This is really the most important phase of really getting buffers going, is that 3-year establishment maintenance. So on the kind of like the right, you see that conservation mowing. So we mow anywhere between 1 to 2 times a year, suppressing that competing vegetation. So you're giving those little trees the most amount of sunlight and nutrients as possible. Down in the middle or central, you can see tree shelter maintenance. So particularly now we've been on some sites this week where flood damage has affected a lot of our project sites. So going out there and making sure the tubes are still intact, the stakes aren't broken, they're not full of silt and mud. So for all of our projects, we go out twice a year and perform maintenance on the tubes and the stakes. And then on that left-hand picture, you see spring replanting. So we're in the process now. When we go out in the fall to do our tree shelter maintenance, we're also doing a survival check. So we try to keep our projects up to 100% survival. So every spring, we go out to every project and replant. And this really helps us to maybe change some species if we notice areas are either more dry or more wet than we were noticing when we planned. This kind of enables us to change the planting plan a little bit and try to ensure 100% survival rate. Next slide. So just a little graph of kind of what we've done so far. So since 2019, we've put in 1,163 acres. That's almost 350,000 trees across 265 projects. I would say probably the lion's share has been in Albemarle, Buckingham, and you kind of see like that 29 corridor. But we've been really getting at it, and we're just received funding. We'll start another grant cycle in 2025 for another 3 years of funding. So we're constantly looking for new projects and new areas to put trees in the ground. Next slide. So just again, kind of a recap, the advantages of the James River Buffer Program. It's no cost to the property owner. There's no project too small. So we've done small kinds of residential sites all the way up to large cattle farms. Doesn't really matter if you do 10 acres, if you do a 1/10 of an acre, if you really get more and more forests on the ground, you really start to see that compounding water quality improve. We provide the 3 years of establishment maintenance, which includes the replacing the dead trees. And then as part of that establishment maintenance, we're also keeping on top of those invasives, which is pretty important. The property owner can choose what species they would like, so you can kind of custom tailor your buffer to really what you want. And there's no tax credit, there's no cost share. Again, we fund the entire operation. So, next slide. All right, volunteer opportunities. This is my sales pitch. So like I said, we do have a lot of projects. We put them with volunteers. As some of the Fuller staff saw earlier this year, we put in a nice little buffer along the Appomattox Greenway. So we do volunteer projects all over the Middle James watershed. And so we rely heavily on our volunteers. You can see the numbers down there at the bottom. Since 2021, they've put in almost 5,000 trees on 16 acres of riparian buffer. And then right now, during our buffer maintenance season, they help us maintain almost 35 acres of buffers. So we really rely on our amazing volunteers to help us get the job done. We're a staff of 4, so it's really hard for us to be able to do what we do without having amazing people to come out and help us. So if anybody's interested in volunteer opportunities, I'll put my information in the chat when I'm done. Next slide. All right, great. So actually, I'm last. So I guess this is a great parlay to say, open it up for questions if anybody has any.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joey and Dea and Blair. This is really great information for everyone. It really is amazing how much funding is out there right now and how easy it's become to do these projects. You know, I've been doing this for quite a long time, and it really is amazing that we have this funding. And then what's really great about this funding is it all comes with these maintenance help, and that really is something the hardest part in making sure what we're doing has a lasting experience. So I'm really excited to see that maintenance as part of all these programs. So right, we do have time for questions. You are welcome to unmute and ask a question or put it in the chat. I think everyone has put their email addresses in, so of course contact anyone directly after this, or contact us at FOLAR, and we're happy to help put you in touch with the right person. I know some of the details, you know, exactly what locality Joey works in or Blair works in, you know, there's some little nuanced details, but we can all help work you through that process and get you to the right people for your property.